Picture this. A single story, no longer than a child's bedtime tale, triggers a royal execution. Not a political manifesto, not a treasonous document, but a simple folktale about a king who ate his own shadow. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most bizarre cases of literary murder, the story of Aldwin the scribe, and the tale that cost him his head. What you're about to hear happened in the year 1360, in the court of King Edmund III of Ravencrest, a kingdom that vanished from maps so completely that most historians refuse to acknowledge it ever existed. But the documents survive, hidden in monastery archives, written in Latin so archaic that only 3 scholars in the world can still translate it. I am one of them. Our story begins not in the royal court, but in the grimy taverns of Lower Ravencrest, where a peculiar tale had been circulating for months among drunks, beggars, and traveling merchants. They called it the Monarch and his Shadow, and like all good folktales, it seemed harmless enough on the surface. The story went like this. Once, there lived a king so vain that he fell in love with his own reflection. But reflections, as we know, are fleeting things. So, this king made a pact with a creature from the Shadowlands. He would trade his mortal soul for the ability to devour his own shadow, thus consuming his own image and keeping it forever within himself. The shadow creature agreed, but warned the king that once he began consuming himself, he would never be able to stop. The king agreed. He began with small bites of his shadow at dusk, then larger chunks at midnight. With each piece he consumed, he grew more powerful but also more hollow. His subjects noticed their ruler becoming increasingly gaunt, increasingly paranoid, increasingly hungry for things that could not be named. The shadow grew smaller each day, and so did the king's humanity. In the tale's climax, the king finally devours the last piece of his shadow and immediately transforms into something unspeakable. A hollow crown sitting atop a throne of bones, ruling over a kingdom of the perpetually starving. The moral was simple. Vanity consumes itself, and power without soul becomes monstrous. Harmless, right? Just another cautionary tale about the dangers of pride. But this story had one problem. It described King Edmund III with terrifying accuracy. You see, Edmund was not just vain, he was obsessively, pathologically vain. Contemporary accounts describe a king who spent 4 hours each morning studying his reflection, who commissioned over 200 portraits of himself, and who had mirrors installed in every room of his castle, including the dungeons. He was also rapidly losing weight, growing increasingly paranoid, and had recently implemented what he called hunger laws, policies that kept his subjects perpetually underfed while the royal court feasted. But here's where our story gets truly disturbing. The folktale wasn't just circulating randomly. Someone was deliberately spreading it, adding new details with each telling. The king in the story began to resemble Edmund more specifically, his love of purple robes, his habit of speaking to mirrors, his peculiar way of eating meat by tearing it with his hands rather than using utensils. By winter of 1360, the tale had evolved into something much more specific and much more dangerous. The storytellers were now describing the shadow creature as a court advisor with eyes like coins, a perfect description of Lord Balthasar, Edmund's most trusted counselor and the man many suspected was the true power behind the throne. Enter Aldwin the scribe. 23 years old, brilliant, and catastrophically naive, Aldwin worked in the royal scriptorium, copying documents and maintaining the king's extensive library. He was also, as we would discover, too late, a collector of stories. Aldwin had been secretly documenting folklore for years, believing himself to be preserving important cultural heritage. He filled manuscript after manuscript with tales, songs, jokes, and local legends. Most scribes would have hidden such frivolous work from their employers, but Aldwin was proud of his collection. He saw himself as a scholar, a preservationist, a guardian of the people's stories. On the night of December 14th, 1367, King Edmund hosted a feast to celebrate the winter solstice. It was during this feast that he made a request that would seal Aldwin's fate. He asked for entertainment, not music, not dancing, but stories. He wanted to hear the tales that his people told about him. The court fell silent. Everyone understood the danger. Kings don't typically enjoy folktales about themselves, especially kings as paranoid as Edmund. But Edmund insisted, and when kings insist, people comply. Several courtiers stammered through sanitized stories about Edmund's supposed heroic deeds. These pleased no one, least of all the king, who could sense their artificial nature. Finally, Lord Balthasar, yes, the same man described as the shadow creature, suggested they call upon Aldwin. After all, he was known to have collected numerous local stories. Aldwin entered the Great Hall carrying his manuscripts. Trembling but honored to be asked to perform for the king, Edmund commanded him to read something authentic, something that common people actually told about their ruler. This is where Aldwin made his fatal mistake. Instead of inventing something flattering or claiming he had no relevant stories, he decided to be honest. He opened his most recent manuscript and began reading The Monarch and His Shadow. According to the trial records, which survive in their entirety, Aldwin made it through exactly half of the story before King Edmund began screaming. The king didn't just stop the performance, he became hysterical. He accused Aldwin of witchcraft, of prophecy, of treason. He claimed that the story wasn't fiction, but some kind of supernatural revelation about his future. Most disturbingly, he seemed particularly enraged by the description of the shadow creature advisor, repeatedly shouting, "How could you know? How could you possibly know?" But here's where our story takes its darkest turn. Lord Balthasar, instead of defending Aldwin or calming the king, immediately declared that the scribe must have been receiving visions from demonic sources. He claimed that Aldwin's collection of folktales was actually a grimoire, a book of spells and prophecies, designed to curse the royal family. Within hours, Aldwin found himself chained in the castle dungeons, charged with witchcraft, treason, and what court documents describe as the malicious prophesying of royal doom through demonic narrative arts. The trial lasted 3 days. During this time, something extraordinary happened. Witnesses began coming forward, claiming they had seen Aldwin performing strange rituals while collecting stories. Tavern keepers swore they had watched him drawing mystical symbols while listening to folktales. Traveling merchants claimed he had paid them with coins that bore no earthly mint marks. All of these testimonies were obvious lies, likely coerced by Lord Balthasar's agents, but they served their purpose. The court declared Aldwin guilty of supernatural treason. Here's what makes this case truly unique. Aldwin wasn't executed for writing the story. He was executed for reading someone else's story too accurately. The court maintained that his crime was not creation, but interpretation that he had somehow used demonic powers to understand the story's true meaning and present it in a way that revealed hidden truths about the king. On December 21, 1367, Aldwin the scribe was beheaded in the castle courtyard, but his death was only the beginning of the real horror. King Edmund, convinced that the folktale had been a supernatural prophecy, became obsessed with preventing its fulfillment. He banned all mirrors from the castle, dismissed Lord Balthasar from his position, and began fasting to avoid growing any thinner. But paranoia, once awakened, doesn't easily sleep. Edmund started seeing shadows everywhere. Not metaphorical shadows, but actual dark shapes that seemed to move independently of their casters. He became convinced that his own shadow was trying to detach itself and fulfill the prophecy by force. Court records describe him spending hours each day trying to step on his own shadow, believing he could keep it attached through physical force. By February, the king had ordered the destruction of every copy of Aldwin's manuscript collection. But here's the truly chilling part. He also ordered the execution of anyone who had ever heard the monarch and his shadow. This included tavern keepers, traveling merchants, storytellers, and ultimately, anyone who had attended the fateful feast where Aldwin first read the tale. Over the next 6 months, King Edmund had 47 people executed for the crime of possessing dangerous narrative knowledge. The kingdom began to empty as people fled to neighboring lands. Those who remained lived in terror, afraid to speak of anything that might be construed as a story. But the prophecy, as prophecies tend to do, fulfilled itself in the end. By autumn of 1368, exactly 1 year after Aldwin's execution, King Edmund had indeed consumed his own shadow, not through supernatural means, but through the very real process of destroying everyone and everything that reflected his image back to him. He had eliminated all mirrors, all portraits, all witnesses to his reign. In trying to prevent the story from coming true, he had made it true. The final entry in the Royal Chronicles, written by the last remaining scribe before he too fled the kingdom, describes King Edmund sitting alone in his throne room, talking. Two shadows that no one else could see, ruling over empty halls and abandoned towns. The scribe wrote that the king had become exactly what the folktale predicted, a hollow crown atop a throne of bones, presiding over a kingdom of the perpetually hungry. The kingdom of Ravencrest collapsed entirely by 1360. When neighboring armies finally entered the territory, they found the castle empty, except for a skeleton wearing a crown, seated on a throne carved with symbols that seemed to move in peripheral vision. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. We still don't know who originally created the monarch and his shadow. The tale appeared simultaneously in multiple locations, told by people who claimed to have learned it from travelers who could never be traced. It was as if the story had simply materialized from the collective unconscious, perfectly crafted to destroy one specific king. Some historians believe the tale was political propaganda, deliberately created to destabilize Edmund's reign. Others think it was simply a coincidence that folktales naturally arise to criticize the powerful, and this one happened to hit too close to home. But there's a third theory, one that most academics refuse to consider seriously. What if the story was exactly what King Edmund believed it to be? What if some stories don't just describe reality, but actually create it? What if Aldwin really had received the tale from some source beyond normal human experience? Consider this: every copy of the original folktale has been destroyed, yet versions of the story continue to surface in different locations, told by people who insist they learned it from sources that cannot be verified. The details change. The king becomes a CEO, a dictator, a social media influencer, but the core remains the same. A powerful figure becomes obsessed with their own image, makes a bargain to possess it completely, and ultimately destroys themselves through consumption of their own reflection. I've spent 15 years researching this case, and I still have no answers. But I have noticed something disturbing. Every time I tell this story, someone in the audience claims they've heard a version of it before, usually involving a contemporary figure who matches the description of the shadow-consuming ruler. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe some stories don't belong to any particular time or place. Maybe they exist in a realm beyond normal narrative space, appearing when and where they're needed to reveal uncomfortable truths about power and vanity. Or maybe I'm just a scholar who spent too long staring into the abyss of forgotten history, seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe Aldwin was just an unlucky man who read the wrong story at the wrong time to the wrong audience. But as I finish writing this script, I can't help but notice something strange happening in my peripheral vision. My shadow on the wall seems to be moving independently, reaching toward my computer screen as if it wants to read what I've written. And I'm suddenly, inexplicably hungry, not for food, but for something I can't quite name. Perhaps it's time to step away from this research. Perhaps some stories are meant to stay forgotten. Perhaps the real horror isn't that a folktale killed a scribe, but that it's still out there, waiting for the next person vain enough to see themselves in its reflection. After all, you've just heard the story of the monarch and his shadow, and if the pattern holds true, that means somewhere in the world, there's someone powerful enough, vain enough, and paranoid enough to make it come true all over again. The question is, are you brave enough to tell someone else this story? Or will you let it die here, in this moment, before it can find its next victim? Sweet dreams.